welcome to our today's European Researchers' Night, and in this scope to our small epistemological intervention related to, as the title says, men, animals, monsters, and women. Theoretical background of our presentations is contemporary philosophy in its broad and widespread impact on the humanities in the context of what has been called French theory, or more specifically by Alain Badiou as one of the most prominent representatives, the French philosophical moment. There were three great moments in the history of philosophy, as Badiou explains in his book on the adventure of French philosophy. First in ancient Greece, from Parmenides to Plato, and the second one related to German idealism, from Kant to Hegel, and finally the adventure of French philosophy, or German idealism from French philosophy or French philosophical moment as the third one, as a reaction to German idealism. There are these three short moments, short and extremely intensive periods in history philosophy, a kind of a condensation of time and space, which could be presented in terms of Hegelian concrete universals. The French moment started with Sartre's book on being and nothingness from 1963, as in Badiou, and would also be related, the starting point, to Claude Lévi-Strauss and his structural analysis in anthropology and linguistics from 1945, which was later, and this is most important for us, for our space, for our geophilosophy, spread to psychoanalysis as a return to Freud by Jacques Lacan as probably the most important representative of structuralism, the so-called structuralism, or more precisely, the structural paradigm, as Jean-Claude Milner has named it, while it ended with Deleuze and Guattari's book on the question of what is philosophy from 1991. However, in a later interview on the German tradition in philosophy, Badiou extended his definition of the French moment into the Franco-Slovene moment, bearing in mind Slavoj Žižek and his followers, as Badiou points out. This seems to be an important move for the French, but it was not elaborated further. And also, it has to be mentioned at the very beginning that Simone de Beauvoir and her book, The Second Sex, as one of the most influential books of the century, is not even mentioned in Badiou or in Žižek either. In this historical and geophilosophical context, one of the most prominent places belongs to Michel Foucault, if we take into account his critical stance to philosophy on the one hand, as well as his somehow detached and ambiguous views on psychoanalysis on the other hand. I would like to offer a new perspective on Foucault as one of the most influential scholars, not enough discussed in our space, in Slovenia, but worldwide, one of the most influential scholars of philosophy and the humanities of our time, and of course, with a particular focus on the unity of his work, which is my main epistemological point. And I think I can make this point even better, even clearer from the described geophilosophical background. But let us proceed step by step. The traditional question of whether Foucault was a philosopher or a historian should be supplemented, and in the structural paradigm as described, actually can be supplemented by an exploration of psychoanalysis as the third main aspect of Foucault's oeuvre. The one that turns out to be, I would venture to say, the privileged side of grappling with power and searching for possibilities of resistance and change. So this new perspective, put in the context of French, or as Badiou also said, Franco-Slovene philosophical moment, unveiling how to grasp Foucault at the intersection of his various paths and periods. Foucault should be presented as a philosopher embracing a true confrontation with Marx. I think this is one of the most important points we have to make. From his early studies on his late work on the history of sexuality, as an epistemologist writing the history of madness from the Renaissance until the present day, and as the reluctant investigator of psychoanalysis, who in the final 2 years of his life antithetically approaches the liberating relationship between speaking, truth, and subjectivity, as he put them in the context of the ethics of care for the self and for others, and draws the contours of the new praxis of freedom. Bringing together different backgrounds and examining their conjunction, the aim of my introductory talk is an answer to the question of how Foucault's concepts can be used to critique contemporary theory, contemporary studies, somehow uncritically spreading around the world and in Slovenia and our university, and to perhaps develop a little bit further Badiou's idea about the Franco-Slovene philosophical moment, especially in relation to psychoanalysis, of course. Let me mention, by the way, that at our university, we have introduced a special field of graduate studies, of PhD studies, of doctoral studies on theoretical psychoanalysis. And I've been told recently by a colleague from University of Calabria that nothing of the kind can be found in Italy. But I have to look for the French situation and tell you more about that on some future occasion. By the way, organizing these kinds of events and putting them in the context of contemporary French philosophical moment is also part of our institutional, or Foucault would say, non-discursive practices related to what we all wish for this practices of freedom. Therefore, let me first focus on Foucault and psychoanalysis. Perhaps I should also mention in the first place, at the very beginning, after introducing the very title of our today's event, that our main path of development, of progress, of change would be wishfully from men, from abstract men. Mensch als abstractum, as Marx would have it. The abstract man beyond sexual difference to the invention of women and the woman at the end of our path, through immediate steps or links, animals, which are going to be on some later occasion introduced by Rajlakshmi Ghosh. As I mentioned, she is ill and cannot be here today. And as presented in the analysis of monsters, which are going to be presented and dissected by our colleague Janja Cotič. First, a very short introduction of Foucault and his epistemological relationship between madness on the one hand and pathology and psychopathology on the one hand, and his later history of sexuality. It's very puzzling for me that everybody presents Foucault's work chronologically and not logically. And I'm sure that this is one of the most prominent logical links in Michel Foucault's oeuvre. One should first think of how to relate madness and sexuality, psychopathology and normality through this very important move of Foucault himself, which brings him extremely close to Freud and psychoanalysis. Actually, it could be argued that psychoanalysis stands and falls on the examination of the relationship between madness and sexuality. Accordingly, I will confront Foucault with a reading of Freud himself, who traced the etiology of madness to sexuality, and thus went beyond the separation of the normal from the pathological. This is what Janja is going to explain more thoroughly later on, as well as beyond any individualizing and normalizing power over the abnormals, as it has been brought into the forefront in Etienne Balibar's brilliant analysis called Foucault's Anti-Marx. We are, of course, speaking about the French philosophical moments. And in this context, I should say, however, it will be shown Foucault's madness in general has to be replaced, will have to be replaced by a much more specific hysteria, female hysteria, hysteria as feminine, from which psychoanalytic science itself arose in Freud's exemplary dreams, as you all know, on the Irma's injection, which are also the dreams from which psychoanalysis proceeds, the dreams on the birth of psychoanalysis, and could be considered as the birth of psychoanalysis as such. Hysteria is regarded as Freud's privileged example of the clinical picture, and as a, I would venture to say, Foucauldian condition of possibility of the very birth of psychoanalysis and of discontinuity, and to use Georges Canguilhem's words, revolution, psychoanalytic revolution in science. And of course, there is a big problem, because Foucault himself actually does not see Sigmund Freud in that way. But on the other hand, I think, and I try to just give you a short glimpse on very telling indications that there is a kind of ambivalence and ambiguity in Foucault's relation to Freud. And this is precisely the terrain we should really focus on in our future epistemological endeavors. Actually, I'll start from the question, how come that such a big break, such a major revolution, such a major historical, scientific event in the humanities, Freud, the most cited name for decades and so on, is somehow absent from Foucault's analysis. His Nietzschean genealogy, in his famous essay on Nietzsche genealogy history, and otherwise, this is really a kind of a nightmare for me, or it used to be a kind of a nightmare. But then, as I had the opportunity to look at it more thoroughly, I figured out that it is also extremely telling, and that we should really proceed along this path, relating, confronting, combining, but not fusing Freud with Foucault, to proceed along the lines which I already described as critical thinking, critical theory, let alone critical psychoanalysis, which I think should really be introduced in the French philosophical moment, let alone in the what Badiou calls Franco-Slovene moment. And by the way, just to give you a hint, in the context of how Foucault relates his discursive and non-discursive institutional criticism of power, the idea at our university is to broaden or to supplement our studies, already mentioned studies, PhD studies in theoretical psychoanalysis, to studies in theoretical and critical psychoanalysis. I think that would be very much along with Foucault's idea of critique and his answer to the question, what is critique? How not to be so much governed in that way by them, which is also very important in the very field of intellectual work, in research, in university teaching, in the way we are able to shape our image of thought. Let me proceed with just a very short introduction of the idea of how we should introduce Freud into the very core of Foucauldian thinking, and then go to the conclusion and introduction of our next speaker. Although they differed in their research methods and their respective epistemological approaches to the production of concepts, Freud and Foucault, it certainly seems that the truth about sexuality was a key preoccupation Foucault and Freud shared, as evident from Foucault's new scientific discourse on sexuality and technology of confession, and from Freud's conception of the psychoanalytic treatment of a talking cure. Proposed in his early studies, his and Breuer's early studies on hysteria. As you all know, the hysteric called Anna O already, as a founder of talking cure, talking therapy, was treated by Joseph Breuer, knew that treatment was not just, as she said, talking cure, but it was also a kind of, as she said in English, chimney sweeping. And that there can be no talking without sexuality when madness, and as we will see, Freud's femininity are involved. So in Freud, we have a nexus which is very much present, I would say, all around Foucault's works in his different periods. But he, I'm afraid, died earlier and didn't have the possibility of bringing them together. The Freudian revolution has its particular birthplace, but this does not refer to the invention of the unconscious. I know I'm being very unorthodox, perhaps also a bit critical, psychoanalytical in this context. But anyway, it is not only the invention of the unconscious, reducible to the discursive and non-discursive constitution of the new object of knowledge. The birthplace of psychoanalysis, to point it out once again, is hysteria, which Freud himself treated, and did so precisely in a way that gave birth to psychoanalysis as a new science and a dangerous method without precedent. A genealogical method, I would say, that pertains to the body, which is precisely the main argument by Michel Foucault himself, to write genealogy instead of history, which is attached to the problem of the body. This is one of the central issues, if not the central issue, in his famous essay on Nietzsche genealogy history. And psychoanalysis is a perfect example, one of the best he could find. Psychoanalysis is a treatment in which Foucault lends his body to the hysteric. This was very much discussed in the tradition called psychoanalysis and feminism. He lends his body to the hysteric, experiencing her symptoms on his own body. Freud was able to breathe to psychoanalysis out of hysteria, and perhaps one could say out of the spirit of speaking, which Freud first studies in terms of the conversion of a psychological problem or the hysteric question into the somatic symptom. I'll have to sum up a little bit the argument, but let me nevertheless remind you to the central question of the hysteric, which is the question whether she is a man or a woman, based on her bodily inscription, which has nothing to do with anatomy and associate it with symptoms ranging from the hysterical cough to paresis and paralysis, hysterical visual, auditory, and speech disorders, hysterical convulsions, and so on and so on. And what is essential, to summarize a little bit, to psychoanalysis and placed by Freud at the very core of his discovery is the associated question of femininity and its difference from masculinity. That is why I said Freud didn't just invent the unconscious. He also invented sexual difference, and two of them has to be put into the forefront together and conceptualized as such. Freud epistemologically assigned it to the place of a riddle. He defined it as a riddle of femininity, which is not directly linked to the, and cannot be directly linked, but it should be mentioned nevertheless to what Michel Foucault studied in his History of Sexuality as the secret of sexuality. And Foucault, of course, related it to history of Christianity. Epistemology of the secret. Let me, by the way, as a note, remind you of a brilliant PhD by Ghosh, one of our students, on epistemology of the secret and on this how to solve the riddle of femininity. But let me go and proceed and conclude with Freud and his hysteria, which he considers to be a disorder of the inscription of seduction or trauma into the body of the young woman as a question of femininity. Am I a woman or a man? Leading to the birth of psychoanalysis precisely in this nexus, in this conceptual network. Regardless of whether Freud's patients are unmarried women or young widows, victims of actual sexual assault, which is extremely important for the present day, or fantasy reminiscences, the reality of which Freud never denies, but has been many times criticized by feminists in this respect. Regardless of whether the problem is too little or too much sexuality, it is a problem of sexuality nevertheless. And I think this is really something which should be brought into the forefront at this very moment where we all are in our everyday lives and political agendas, let alone theoretical and conceptual research. And that can be seen even better if we somehow navigate and negotiate between Foucault and Freud. Freud highlights the basic choice offered by the clinic, the choice between neurosis and motherhood, both of which can be replaced by what Freud calls the masculinity complex. Even in Freud, the woman is positioned as the negative or the mirror image of man, but nevertheless, Freud always adds that there is a problem, there is no symmetry, that we should make some further research in this relation. And last but not least, normal femininity, in contrast to hysteria or neurosis, results in the psychoanalytically introduced instance of the mother and motherhood. And this is one of the lines of development where Janja is going to proceed from. And I would like just one more time put into the front that Freud actually, in relation to femininity, in his invention of women, offered what we could call free paths, free ways, free approaches, free developments of femininity. On the one hand, we have neurosis with hysteria as a privileged clinical picture. On the other side of the coin, there is motherhood as a kind of a cure to neurosis. And then the third possibility for Freud is masculinity complex. This is a kind of a negative definition of femininity. None of Freud's roads to femininity seem to be particularly wide-reaching, I would say, nor does Freud himself have much to say about them. And here is actually precisely the point at which we should proceed by Michel Foucault. which is extremely interesting, and it's very transparent in Foucault's analysis and his research and his writings, but nobody actually would venture to say it loudly. And I'm doing this on this occasion, most definitely, and I'm going to proceed it in the very near future as well, which is, to put it in an extremely summarized manner, the fact that Foucault himself made a plan of writing his history of sexuality in 6 volumes. 6 volumes. Only the first volume was published in 1976, as planned as the first one. And then the 2 next volumes were actually published in a hurry in the year before his actual death. But Foucault's plan when publishing the first book, called The Will to Knowledge, was to publish 6 books, and on the cover, on the back cover of the book, there is the explicit plan that number 4 of his history of sexuality should be entitled, is going to be, that was Foucault's original plan, entitled The Woman, the Mother, and the Hysteric. So actually, we have in the very title, and in Freud's and in Foucault's thinking, we have this Freud's free paths or free images or free related positions, how, as an answer, a possible, not so good, as we said, not so promising answer to the question, what is a woman? And I am really so sorry that Foucault himself never managed to proceed along this way. So let me make the second conclusion. In relation to Foucault's title, Foucault's project, Foucault's research project, book 4 of his 6 planned books on history of sexuality, The Woman, the Mother, and the Hysteric. This is actually the Freudian mechanism of the inscription of madness into the body, a very Foucauldian point, how to write history and genealogy, a mechanism that reaches beyond anatomy and medical order and could be placed on the side of the genealogical identification of the what we might call with Foucault the physical price, the bodily price of the hysteric's medical history. It could well be the case that this was to be included in volume 4 of Foucault's work on the history of sexuality, which would connect femininity with hysteria and motherhood, the latter being the other side, to point it out once again, the other side, or a sort of a negative image of hysteria, according to Freud. From this perspective, Foucault's project appears immediately and explicitly Freudian. It seems as though Foucault too wanted to talk about the free fates of women, or the free roads into womanhood, none of which are considered especially gratifying. But anyway, this is actually the common denominator of madness and sexuality in psychoanalysis and in Foucault's history, first history of madness and last history of sexuality. And this is where we can and should proceed. And I'm going to conclude with probably the most blasphemic thing which can be said about Michel Foucault, who is very dear to me, and well, very center for my work, that Freud and the name of Sigmund Freud and Freudian revolution is actually a major break, a discontinuity in the humanities, in sciences, in our images of ourselves, which Foucault didn't want to or could not or was not able to admit. I think that if it might have been the case that he might have written the fourth book of the history of sexuality on the woman and mother and the hysteric, in that case, perhaps he could make this final step, admitting that there is real discontinuity related precisely to what Georges Canguilhem, in his opposition to Michel Foucault, called Freudian revolution, or the scandal of the three revolutions, Copernican, Darwinian, and Freudian, as Canguilhem explicitly writes about them. And we started from the main school of thought that shaped Michel Foucault, namely the French epistemology and the French philosophical moment, which was also the domain of Foucault's mentor, Georges Canguilhem, who regarded Foucault's Madness and Civilization as a history, I'll end with a quotation from Georges Canguilhem, from Renaissance to the birth of psychoanalysis. For the conclusion, let me once again emphasize the birth of psychoanalysis as a major epistemological break, a form of radical discontinuity which was absent in Foucault's early madness, a history of madness, as well as his later history of sexuality, but was crucial in the eyes of his mentor, Georges Canguilhem, and I would venture to say, seems to be of utmost importance for reflections on the subject and subjectivity in contemporary philosophy, let alone for Badiou's French philosophical moment, or what he extended to Franco-Slovene philosophical moment. Freud invented the woman, no more and no less than that. And I hope I had made at least the center point clear, that we have to proceed from abstract man to concrete, real flesh and blood men and women, and how this should be elaborated further on epistemologically step by step is going to be presented by Janja Cotič, our PhD student, who last week actually finished her PhD research and submitted her thesis, and is still living and breathing and prepared to be here with us today. Janja, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Eva. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Everybody can hear you, I think. It's just one thing, Janja, something crossed my mind, which is that Polona Misec, who is here with us today, has also submitted her thesis last week. It was a very fortunate week for all of us. We'll have to leave earlier, and I would perhaps ask Polona to say a word or two before, Janja, you proceed, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, of course.
Polona, you mentioned that you have to leave at around 6. And thanks for being here anyway. I'm so
Hello,
sorry about all
everybody.
this confusion in information and everything. The university system of sending information is collapsed today, and it was yesterday collapsed because there was an intrusion from the outside, and there's a lot of danger related to it. But I'm happy that I have sent you a personal note, and that Polona, you're here today. And of course, I should have congratulated Janja and you for submitting your thesis. It's excellent that you could do it apart from all your work you have to do to survive, and children and all feminist struggles you're being involved in all the time. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I don't know what I can say. Yes, I submitted my dissertation, but of course I am still somehow preparing my defense and so on. So maybe I should just mention that my thesis is entitled Gender and the Position of Enunciation, and that I thematize sexual difference precisely as coming from, well, first for me, Simone de Beauvoir, even before Freud, with the reason for this is because if you're a woman, the question of how you can ask about your status and about your human condition is much more complex than in a general, I don't know, let's say human subject, or usually it is said mankind. So I start with Beauvoir and her statement, "I'm a woman," even if she's historically later than Freud, and with the fact that her statement does not refer to a definition of woman, but tries to explore her position from which she can speak. And I ask in the text what is the relation and what is the need for psychoanalysis when asking about my own condition as a woman. And I relate this to linguistics, to the theory of enunciation with Émile Benveniste, where I'm trying to relate the exclusion of woman and through Foucault's, actually Foucault's history of madness and psychoanalysis, Freud's psychoanalysis and his hysteric, to how can this exclusion become epistemologically somehow accessible to the woman, and how can sexual difference be inscribed into language, in short. So thank you. I think that perhaps Janja should present her
yes.
prepared.
Thank you very much, Polona. It's very comforting to have you here because I just got the message from Gaia that she didn't get any information about this event today, and she would be very happy to join in. And I'm afraid that some others might have had the same problem. So I'm really happy to have you here, and I would really go on with Janja's presentation while Janja is still capable of opening her mouth, not collapsing before the end of the session. I really hope so, because there had been so much illness around, and we are all in the middle of it. So let's hope for the best, Janja. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So
Just
let's
say
start.
what you can say, and if you can't have, if you won't have any voice anymore, we'll all, notice it right away.
I will do my best.
Thank you, Janja, for not
Okay.
deserting us at this very tense moment.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
okay. Thank you. So let's start first with normal and pathological. Understanding the normal and the pathological and establishing a relationship between them means recognizing and acknowledging the originality and specificity of life in all living beings. Normal is a term that has passed into the vernacular from the specific vocabularies of medical and educational institutions and has become a category of ordinary judgment, unfortunately. An examination of Canguilhem's epistemological analysis of the normal and the abnormal is relevant to the theorization of the key judgments related to human conception and activity, since it constitutes a strong critic of the traditional mechanistic conception of life, according to which a disease or a state of illness is nothing more than a quantitative deviation, an excess or deficit of a normal state, which in turn is nothing more than a statistically calculable average. The key to the concept of the relationship between the normal and the pathological is the norm. In his seminar entitled The Abnormals, Les Anormaux in French, Foucault emphasizes Canguilhem's observation that the norm is not defined as natural law at all, but by the demanding and coercive role it can play in the domains in which it is applied. So there is the norm as a rule of conduct and the norm as a functional regulation, or a norm that opposes irregularity and disorder, and the norm that opposes the pathological and morbid. Here, as Foucault points out, the function of the norm is not to exclude and reject, but the norm is always linked to a positive technique of mediation and transformation, a kind of normative project, bringing new light on the long history of monsters and monstrosity. So why it is necessary for Canguilhem to return to the abnormal in explaining the value of life and the concepts that articulate this knowledge? Because, according to Canguilhem, the abnormal is logically secondary, since it is the logical negation of the normal, and existentially, the abnormal is primordial, since it had to exist as such in order for the normal to be established. The concept of normal is objectively defined in biology based on the frequency of the characteristics that is labeled as normal. In 1759, the word normal appears. In 1834, the word normalized appears. Canguilhem says that in this 75 years period between these 2 years, a normative class had won the power to identify the function of social norms whose content is determined with the use that class made of them. Namely, the norm on the basis of the normative regulation consolidates the normal. Therefore, such a decision referring to this or that norm is understandable only in the context of other norms. The term normal has spread into general use, as we said before, from the vocabularies of medical and educational institutions. Normal is a term used in the 19th century to denote both the state of healthy organism and the prototype of school. The term normal can be the result of an external choice and decision, or it can be an internal reference point and qualification criterion. In any case, the property of an object or fact called normal in reference to an external or immanent norm is the ability to be considered in its turn as the reference for objects or facts which have yet to be in a position to be called such. The normal is then, as Canguilhem says, at once the extension and the exhibition of the norm. It increases the rule at the same time that it points it out. It asks for everything outside, beside, and against it that still escapes it. A norm draws its meaning, function, and value from the fact of the existence outside itself of what does not meet the requirement it serves. The normal is not a static or peaceful, but a dynamic and polemical concept. This means that in the moment in which a norm indicates a rule, it already multiplies it. In doing so, it derives its function and value from the fact that there exists outside of it that which does not correspond to the requirement that the norm serves. Normal cannot therefore be a static and conflict-free concept, but can only be dynamic and polemic. Normal is an effect achieved by the execution of a normative plan, is the norm shown in fact. Therefore, in terms of fact, a relation of exclusion always exists between the normal and the abnormal or pathological. We shall continue now with monsters and monstrosity. In the famous article La monstrosité et la monstrueuse, translated into English as Monstrosity and the Monstrous, Canguilhem showed how the scientific imagination produced the monstrosity. It is based on the premise that the existence of monsters calls into question the power of life to teach us order. All that is needed is a disillusionment in this self-confidence, a morphological deviation, the appearance of a particular ambiguity for us to be gripped by radical fear, says Canguilhem. As living beings, we are the true effects of the loss of life and the possible causes of life in our species. So failure in life affects us doubly because failure may have happened to us and failure may have come through us. And continues, it is only because we humans are living beings that a morphological defect is a monster in our living eyes. If we were pure reason, inert and indifferent to our possibilities of thinking, then the monster would only be different from the same, an order other than the most probable order. Canguilhem says that we must reserve the qualification monster for organic beings. There are no mineral monsters, there are no mechanical monsters. Something with no rule of internal cohesion, something whose form and dimensions cannot be seen as divergences from a module that can be expressed in terms of a measure, mold, or model, cannot be called monstrous. Foucault actually uses Canguilhem's concepts of monstrosity in the context of the research he lectured in a seminar in 1974 to 1975 at the Collège de France, entitled Les Anormaux, in translation, abnormal. In order to demonstrate the emergency of an abnormal individual, he follows the analysis of two genealogical lines. The first is the line of juridical legal medical autonomy, which involves the connection and interviewing of psychiatry and the law, and the emergence of technology of abnormality. The second is the line of family medical authority, which involves connecting and interviewing the family and psychiatry by expanding the problem of sexuality and the degeneration into psychiatry. Through the archaeology of abnormality, Foucault showed that the domain of abnormality that operated in the 19th century was composed of three figures. The human monster, the individual to be corrected, and the masturbator or masturbating child, which began to be distinguished and defined in the 18th century. Excuse me. These three figures are the three elements in which the problem of abnormality gradually took shape in such a way that they combined and intervened in the 19th century to create a domain of abnormality that gradually overlapped and appropriated them to the point of their absorption. The human monster is the first of the three figures that make up the domain of abnormality. The human master's frame of reference is nature and society. The concept of a monster is a legal concept in the broader sense of the system of laws of the world, because its existence and form mean the violation of laws on two levels: at the level of social laws and at the level of the laws of nature. The field in which the monster appears is therefore a legal biological field. The next characteristic of the human monster is that it appears as an extreme and extremely rare phenomenon. The monster is the limit. It is both the point at which the right is annulled, and it is at the same time the exception found only in extreme cases. The monster combines the impossible and the forbidden, and the master is in fact against the law. It is a violation of the law to the greatest possible extent. Well, the paradox of the monster is that although it means breaking the law to the greatest possible extent, or in a kind of most brutal state, it does not trigger a response on the part of the law that would be a legal response. The monster, therefore, by its very existence, violates the law, which itself does not respond to that violation, and triggers the response of something quite different from the law itself. It triggers violence, or the will to oppress, medical care, or mercy. Paradoxically, the monster has become the principle of intelligibility, despite its liminal position of the impossible and the forbidden. Foucault emphasizes that this principle is strictly tautological, since the characteristic of the monstrosity is that it expresses itself precisely as monstrous, that is the explanation of every small deviation that can arise from it, and at the same time it is itself incomprehensible. Thus, at the center of analysis of abnormality is precisely this tautological intelligibility, this principle of explanation that refers only to itself. These are Foucault words. A monster is therefore a natural transgression, a mixture of species and blurring of boundaries and characteristics. So, in the legal and scientific tradition from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, a monster can be a mixture of two kingdoms, the kingdom of animal and the kingdom of man. For example, a man with the head of an ox, or a man with the feet of a bird. A mixture of two types, for example, a pig with a sheep's head. Then a monster can be also a mixture of two individuals. For example, a person who has two heads and one body, a person who has two bodies and one head. Then a monster can also be a mixture of two sexes. For example, a person who is male and female. A mixture of life and death. For example, fetus that survives only a few minutes or days with a morphology that means it will not be able to live. A mixture and a monster can also be a mixture of shapes or form. For example, a person who has neither arms nor legs, who is, for example, like a snake. In the process of connecting psychiatry and justice in the period from 1840 to 1860 or 1875, with many processes of normalization, when the extraordinary and great monster dissolved into a swarm of primary abnormalities of behavior, conduct, and attitudes, psychiatry was organized, which we defined, according to Foucault, as technology of abnormality. This psychiatry as a technology of abnormality started to deal with the field of sexuality from the very beginning in two ways. The first was the identification of the phenomena of heredity and degeneration, which were applied to the field of abnormality as an analytical grid by which this field is codified and divided. This means that the medical and psychiatric analysis of reproductive functions become part of the methods for analyzing abnormality. The second line means the way of defining characteristics disorders of sexual abnormality or sexual pathology, and appeared at first as a series of special cases of abnormality. Around 1880 to 1890, it appeared as the foundation and general etiological principle of most other forms of abnormality. Analyzing the expansion of the issue of sexuality into psychiatry, Foucault proved that this was not the result of the abolition or of censorship of speech about sexuality or the repression of sexuality, but that it was actually a transformation of the positive practice of forced and compulsory confession. He says that we have had sexuality since the 19th to 18th century, and before that there was carnality. From the 19th century, this area becomes of central strategic importance because, on the one hand, it represents access to life, the body and the life of the species, and at the same time, it serves us as a matrix of disciplining and as a principle of regulation. As Foucault said, Sexuality is exactly at the intersection of the body and the population, so it depends on discipline, but also on regulation. Foucault shows that with this we have arrived at power, a biopower that began to take into account both the body and life. This means began to consider life in general, with one pole for the body and the other for the population. Foucault notes that as far as legal and medical reflection is concerned, at different times there have been privileged types of monsters around which and on which the entire focus has been directed. In the Middle Ages, it was a bestial type of monster where it is a mixture of two kingdoms, human and animal. So this is a monster that is both man and beast. In Renaissance, both in literature in general and in medical, legal, and religious books, conjoined or Siamese twins were privileged as a type of monster. This type of monster is a multiplication and mixture of two individuals, an individual who has one head and two bodies, or one body and two heads, one who is two and two who are one. Siamese twins are the most common theme in legal, medical, and religious analysis from the late 16th and early 17th century. In the classical age, however, a third type of monster is privileged. That is the hermaphrodite, who is a mixture of two sexes. From the Middle Ages to the beginning of the 17th century, hermaphrodites were counted among monsters, and only because of the fact that they were declared hermaphrodites, that is, monsters due to the mixture of two sexes. It was a monstrosity of nature for which they were executed and burned at the stake. This monstrosity of nature will be soon replaced by a new one, by a moral monstrosity, or more precisely, monstrosity of behavior. In Abnormal, Foucault shows us how the new figure of the monster that emerged at the end of the 18th century and which was already at work at the beginning of the 19th century began to develop around the question of hermaphrodites rather than around questions related to other types of monsters. He cites two almost isomorphic examples of hermaphrodites, the first from 1601 and the second from 1765, more than 150 years later, suggesting a development significant in the genealogy of monsters. This is about disappearance of the monstrosity of hermaphrodite nature, which for centuries was enthroned as a mixture of the sexes, as a violation of everything that separates one sex from the other. However, at the same time, it is precisely at this turning point that another notion of monstrosity begins to develop, found at the beginning, as we said before, of the 19th century, in which the mixing of the sexes is no longer a question. Foucault says then that then there are only eccentricities, types of imperfections, and bad structures, the defects of nature, which can be the source or cause of many forms of criminal conduct. So the old category of monster has moved from the domain of somatic and natural disorders to the domain of criminality. In doing so, the focus shifted from the monstrosity of nature to the monstrosity of behavior. With this, in fact, a complete reversal took place for the monstrosity of nature, was no longer legally questionable and consequently no longer required any condemnation. With the new assumption that monstrosity was behind all criminality, it was then the monstrosity of behavior that called for condemnation. I don't know if I have some time left, Eva.
Shall I share the screen, or shall I go to chat what you sent to me?
Maybe you should go to chat and
Chat, yes.
open the file.
Chat. Let me see.
So we can show those figures or images.
Just a moment. Let me see the options. Janja, I have this option of figures of monstrosity from Davidson here in chat, and there's an arrow. Let me see if it doesn't show on the screen, but let me try once again. Perhaps reply? No. I can download, copy, delete. I have only the possibilities of downloading, copying, and deleting it. But perhaps we should continue with the discussion or with your conclusion, and later on make a shorter break and go to these figures, which are really fascinating. I'm so sorry about this. But I have the book here, and at least I can show it like that. Is it possible to see anything? Aha, I have this blurred background. Let me just put off the background. Video filter without the background. None. There we go. Can you see these monsters with several legs and heads? And which one did you actually want to address to? There's a small child with two heads. This one with two heads. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Or is there a special one?
An example of lack in the quantity of seed. No. This one is example of too great a quantity of seed.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned the monsters as creatures in between men and animals. There we have this one.
That one, yeah, of course.
Half animal, half man. And let me see. Oh, and of course, then you probably had the intention to mention the famous case of the elephant man.
Yeah, of course. Could you please?
Yeah, elephant man was one of the most famous examples of the so-called monstrosity in our not so faraway history. And as perhaps you might have come across the movie a famous movie by David Lynn called The Elephant Man, describing what was actually happening to this individual with very special malformations on the body, on the skin, on the tissues, and so on. Here we have another example from Davidson's. This is a photography of a man creeping around, not being able to stand upright and walk. And now I remember, Janja, you probably, we have this half animal, half man. You see? This is extremely interesting. The way you present it as Foucault's work on monstrosity, which is actually described as scientific imaginary. The scientists themselves had this totally unreal, totally fantasy created ideas of these mixtures, or half man, half animal, or on the other hand, half woman, half man. And of course, there's another point in this Davidson's essay about how the images of the monsters have been used in political life to discredit the important political figures. This is the figure of the monk calf, which has been used, I think, during the time of Martin Luther. And the Pope and the Pope. Yes, this is a very nice one to conclude with. Can you say it? It would be better to have your PowerPoint, Janja.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, we have this.
I don't know why.
No, it's we'll definitely have it. Everything done as it should till we edit the final version of this event on the video. But let me now proceed to the discussion and the questions, and perhaps ask colleague Urhan Brosh, who is in the middle of his PhD studies, perhaps some comments in relation to biopolitics. You also wrote in one of the chapters of your developing PhD on Foucault's biopolitics. Perhaps you could say a word about that, if you're not too ill, as we all are.
No, do you hear me? I'm trying to fix my computer. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear
I
you.
will try to. I'll try to put a video now. I have some little problems, but just a second, please.
Yeah.
Is it working? Computer is a bit slow today. I don't know why, but okay, now I can see you.
Thank you very much for joining it.
Can we speak in Slovenian now? As I see, we are all here Slovenian speaking.
Yeah, of course, whatever you prefer. Well,
I mean, I don't know.
We have this event recorded since it's officially part of the European Researchers' Night, and I have it as a document. Perhaps you make a short comment in English, and when we officially actually make an end to this session, then we proceed in Slovenian.
Maybe.
What do you say?
Maybe I would just, I would like to have a short questions considering monstrosity in propaganda. I also had a short text about that. So how it differs through the history, let's say like a text from Edmund Burke, like two reflections on French Revolution. It is clearly in the text that he is using like a monstrosity to picture French Revolution. But of course, it is using it in a completely different way than it is used later in Nazism. So where we have like monstrosity connection with degeneration and so on. So I would like to say maybe in propaganda also these figures are changing, like they were presented here historically. So that would be maybe my opinion or question.
Thank you very much for your question, your comment. I remember very well your essay, which was extremely interesting. The way you actually try to relate conceptually the most elaborated approaches. On the one hand, in Althusser and his analysis of ideology in relation to and in opposition to science and sciences on the one hand, and on the other hand, Foucault with his idea of biopolitics as a management and disciplining of the whole population apart from the individual body of the individual, the macro body of the population. And it is extremely interesting for me how you try to combine them, and let alone what is going to come out of your analysis. Where could we let me use another very famous example. During the time of the French Revolution, for the political propaganda or denunciation of famous influential political figures, it was very fashionable and useful. It seems to be very appropriate to use pornography. Pornography as a public means, you know, to in a way present aristocrats in special pornographic figures to denounce their power and credibility and rationality, whatever. And in this case, I was actually thinking about the way that how this idea of monsters and monstrosity can be widespread, and to what it can be applied and what not. For instance, the monstrosity in cultural studies has been related to what you probably heard about Barbara Creed and her book on the monstrous feminine. And it is about the film presentations of the female genital organs as something which is monstrous and related to bodily monstrosity. And of course, you have these female figures of, you know, opening up large mouth, and of course you have the monstrous feminine related to the movie Carrie. I should put more light in. You remember Sissy Spacek with the monstrous feminine blood and so on and so on. But I think this is actually just a kind of an attempt to you know, figure out the imaginary of contemporary media and film and so on and so on. And I'm so glad, Janja, that you could present us an epistemological path through the history of monstrosity, which is on the other side of this cultural studies, postmodern approaches. And perhaps I should have mentioned in the first place, at the very beginning of our meeting, that, you know, the very title, Men, Animals, Monsters and Women, might sound a little bit too cultural and culturalist, cultural studies or postmodern, whatever. Perhaps I should explain that the general topic of this year's European Night of Researchers, of all the events which are taking place at the same time, mostly around Ljubljana in different places, is Men and Animals. And what we actually wanted to do is to bring in some new epistemological light and other categories to show that we should definitely, if we want to talk about the relationship and also the difference between men and animals, bring in a very important epistemological figure of the norm and the abnormality and the abnormals and the monsters and monstrosities. And Janja, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. It's really something we very much need in our endeavor to, stick to the basic concept, the creation and the birth of the concepts in the context of our PhD studies, and not to fall to some fashionable trends and so on. Perhaps I should, at this point, end the official session and the recording, and then we can proceed with a more informal discussion, if that is all right with you.